I'd like to talk about, I think, Nietzsche's understanding, whether this understanding in him was conscious or subconscious. I think Nietzsche understood something very well that most modern Christians don't understand. And that is the distinction, the difference between anti-Christian versus anti-Christ. The difference between them. And I think, and someone can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think if you look it up, Nietzsche's own book, The Antichrist, could actually be translated as anti-Christian. That it's not necessarily the Antichrist. Now, the book, The Antichrist, for me, and I'll get more into this later, but to me, The Antichrist is a very powerful book. It's certainly an important book. However, I have more criticisms of this book, maybe, than all the rest. As I explained in the previous video that I posted, I think Nietzsche, in The Antichrist, he got sloppy. And he lost sight of some things that he knew in his book, in his Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Now, whether he knew these things in Zarathustra explicitly, consciously or not, or whether he knew them just subconsciously, I'm not exactly sure. I've noticed a phenomenon with the Germans in general, that, as Carl Jung said very interestingly, and as I've only recently found out, Carl Jung said in his Red Book, and he put it in the mouth of the Red One, which was considered Carl Jung's devil, that the Germans do indeed, when it comes to the Bible, they take everything too literally. And they are bad at seeing the nuance in the Bible, and that's certainly true. However, Germans in general, I think, sometimes, very specific individual Germans, and I think I've talked about this a little bit in another previous video, certain particular Germans are able to, in kind of an otherworldly state of mind, even though consciously they're really bad at breaking down the nuance in the Bible, and they tend to over-literalize everything. In a certain state of mind, they are actually capable of extreme profundity. And as I've mentioned, I think Jacob Beeman is one of those guys who did that. And Nietzsche also in his Zarathustra. And particularly Carl Jung, who was, I think, half German and half Swiss, but particularly Carl Jung in his The Red Book, and maybe in some other writings. That's another thing for another day. But in The Antichrist by Nietzsche, whether consciously or not, I think Nietzsche understood something that he never really articulated. And that is about the actual phrase, the Antichrist itself, Antichrist, versus the phrase anti-Christian. And the profound meaning that is there underneath it all. But in order to explain this, I have to go back in history. And I have to do, actually, I'm forced to do a little bit of theology and history. But we have to understand Nietzsche's The Antichrist and the deeper profundity that he understood on one level or another, you have to go back to the word, you're forced to go back to the word, the phrase, the name, Jesus Christ. We have to go back and consider the phrase Jesus and Christ put side by side. Now, as I've explained in my book, and in many other places on my Substack as well, the words Jesus and Christ put side by side is something that we've lost sight of the significance of. The phrase Jesus Christ is so common, I think that probably now, it's such a cliche, that probably now the majority of society actually would literally think that Christ was Jesus's last name, which of course is a big mistake. Because the way they named people back then, it was like your name from where you're from. So if my name's Bob, then I'd be Bob from Uruguay. Now, my name's actually Jonathan, and I'm from Canada, so it'd be like Jonathan from Canada. And as it was with Jesus, Jesus was known as the Nazarene. He was Jesus of Nazareth because he came from Nazareth. And what we've done over all these years, so when we speak of the person, Jesus, we call him Jesus Christ by habit. And we forget, and this speaks to the success of the Christian movement, how it has utterly dominated history. Happily or regretfully, depending on your perspective, how utterly dominant Christianity has become, that we speak of Jesus Christ matter-of-factly. So this name Christ, you have to kind of reconnect with that. What of this word Christ? Well, Christ is basically Christos, I think, in the Greek, and has to do with the word Mashiach, where we get our word Messiah. And you have to go back to the 1st century, and you have to understand that the majority of Jewish people, Israelites, ancient Israelites, were, maybe not a majority, a large portion of them, maybe the majority, were expecting a Mashiach, a Messiah, in one form or another. But most of them were anticipating that the Mashiach, the Messiah to come, would be a political liberator, someone who would redeem the nation, the ancient nation of Israel, from oppression, from the oppression under Rome. You see, because the ancient Israelites, while under Roman subjugation, as they had also been subjugated by many nations before Rome, Babylon, and before that others, under Rome, the general situation when Rome conquered you in ancient times, they would go into your area, conquer you, bring you, assimilate you. A lot of the conquered nations that Rome conquered and brought within their empire, they would get to a place where they were like, you know what? Like down the road, after being conquered, after maybe some of the resentment faded away. After being conquered, they'd be like, you know what? It's actually better to be in Rome. It's actually a good thing that we were conquered. They looked at their life beforehand, and they were like, our own culture, our own country, whatever, it was fraught with strife and internal division and so many problems, right? And now in Rome, life's actually much better. Some people would come to think, yeah, maybe it's not so bad to be conquered by Rome. Maybe that's a good thing. And so I'd say even the majority of those conquered by Rome were like, this isn't so bad. Then they embraced it wholeheartedly. Being a Roman became something they became grateful for, and to the point, and this is the point I'm getting at, to the point that they'd be willing to just let their old identities go. And then being Roman became more important than being what they were before. And they'd fully embrace Roman identity and the Roman pantheon, the gods, and the worship of Caesar as a god in ascension to divinity after he dies, which was called apotheosis. So people would literally assimilate their gods into the Roman pantheon, and the Romans were always eager to assimilate the gods of other nations into their pantheon as well, as long, of course, Caesar is Lord. And that was important that you recognize that Caesar is Lord. Like, it's really important that you recognize that. That was a condition of really, and it's what kept the people together. I discuss that in my book about religion, the word religion versus the word religio. So our word religion comes from the word religio, which means to bind people together. And so the religio of the Roman state, or the cult meaning devotion of the Roman state, was Caesar worship. So people would become assimilated into Rome. They'd eventually become grateful, except for these stubborn monotheistic Israelites who refused to worship. They would just refuse to worship the gods of the Romans or any other gods. For them, there was only one God worth worshiping. It's not necessarily that they were monotheistic per se, in the sense that they disbelieved in the existence of the other gods, but rather that they were more henotheistic. They believed in the supremacy of the other gods. And so they were very stubborn. And they, unlike the other conquered nations within Rome, they remained defiant of the worship of the Roman pantheon and of Caesar. And so there was a much greater historical tightrope that had to be walked between the Jewish leaders and the Roman leaders, and they were trying to accommodate each other under this, like, very opposed value systems were trying to be accommodated in this nation of Rome. And Rome actually bent over backwards to try to accommodate them and gave them a lot of freedom. So Romans would get exemption from the worship of Caesar, right? And so Rome, despite being the Israelites, despite being subjugated, they were nonetheless, they had many privileges within this Roman Empire. And it was within this context where they had so many privileges that they would forget that they were still subjugated. Indeed, some of the religious leaders in cahoots with Rome, in compromise with Rome, would become so powerful and so wealthy that it was easy to forget that they were still slaves. They were still subjugated. They were still, like, Rome could, And so in this context, these Israelites, these Jews, they would, unlike the other nations, they were very defiant of the Roman pantheon. And yet, Rome would still accommodate them. Still, nonetheless. And so, even though accommodated by Rome, they remained defiant, and they were still looking for a Messiah, a Mashiach to come, who would ultimately liberate Israel from subjugation by Rome. Ultimately liberate them, despite their many perks and privileges, which made them very corrupt, by the way. Despite those perks and privileges, they still were looking for a Messiah to come who would liberate them from geopolitical bondage and restore them to geopolitical independence, freedom, as they had been in ancient times. Hundreds, long time of years before. They were looking forward to that, to a Messiah. Now, and part and parcel of being a political liberator, the Messiah would also be like a warlord or like a political figure who would defeat Rome, bring the Jews together, and establish Israel as an independent nation again. That despite the perks they got under Rome, they would be liberated from them entirely. And so the Jews, the whole time under subjugation, even though they were becoming codependent to their Roman overlords, they were still resentful of them at the same time. A very noxious and toxic psychological dynamic. And it was in this context where they were codependent and yet privileged by the very state they wanted to escape, where they were anticipating a Messiah, Mashiach, a Christos, a Christ, to come and liberate them. And then, weirdly, while they're expecting a political Christos to liberate them, this weird movement, these people called Christians, start saying that this crucified slave has risen from the dead to the place of honor in heaven. even, and was King of Kings and Lord of Lords. King of all kings and Lord of all lords, including Caesar. Someone who had suffered the death of a slave. Crucifixion, the most humiliating of all humiliation rituals. Was it a horrible death? Yes. Was it the worst torture you could ever imagine? Yes. But can you imagine that there was something in their thinking that was worse than even the torture of death? Even the torture of death, physical torture, there was something worse. Yes, the humiliation. To Rome, the humiliation was the whole point and the worst part of it. And for the Jews, for the Israelites, who only believed in one God, that also, the humiliation was the worst part of it. In fact, one could argue, as I do in my book, that the humiliation of the crucifixion was even worse for the Israelites, as it was for the Romans, which was bad enough for the Romans. Because you lived in an ancient society of collective honor and shame. An honor-shame society that is more akin, by the way, to our modern countries like Japan, who still have that ethos. Many Asian countries still have that ethos of public honor and shame. Us Westerners, after 2,000 years of Christianity, we no longer have collective public honor and shame. We've internalized that honor and shame, and we call it now guilt. But it's really just the shame that people used to experience collectively, now directed inwardly. And that's the result of 2,000 years of Christianity, which is another topic I'll get into later. But within this context, people were expecting a political liberator to liberate them from Rome. But this Jesus of Nazareth, this non-citizen slave, was telling people that Israel would not be liberated politically because they had been unfaithful to their own ideals, to their own covenant. And this Jesus was saying instead, this slave, who would eventually end up crucified, was telling people that far from Israel being liberated by a political liberator and made to be independent again, actually, in fact, because of their great and heinous sins over hundreds of years, over ages of time, actually, their nation would be destroyed. And actually, as it turns out, about 40 years after Jesus warned of this, Jerusalem and its sacred temple of animal sacrifice, that, by the way, was a wonder to the whole world, was actually annihilated. The city of Jerusalem was destroyed. A horrific bloodbath of death where 1 million people plus were said to be destroyed, annihilated under the destruction at the hands of Emperor Titus, the Roman general. Emperor? No, just general, yeah. Anyway, so this Jesus actually ended up being right. Jerusalem was not liberated by a Messiah. But these Christians were going around saying that this Jesus who predicted the destruction of Jerusalem was not just a prophet of the destruction of Jerusalem, but that this Jesus was also the Messiah. He was the Christ, the Christos, who was anticipated to be a political liberator. But they were saying this Jesus doesn't actually politically liberate you. They were claiming he changes your heart and he raises you up with Jesus to heaven, to this eternal status of glory. And they were like, when people heard this, they're like, what? No, we weren't expecting a spiritual Christos. We were expecting a political Christos. That's what we want. We don't want spiritual liberation. What are you on about? We want political liberation. But these Christians, they were stubborn, very, very stubborn. And they're like, no, Jesus is Christos. And that's the way we get this word, Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ. Jesus the Christos. Slave is the Christos. Crucified, humiliated slave is actually the Christos. What? That broke people's brains. They broke people's brains. So I needed to give you that background so that I can say this about Nietzsche and his book, The Antichrist. When you actually read The Antichrist and you get a feel for what Nietzsche's aiming at, you realize it's not so much anti-Christ as it is anti-Christian. Nietzsche understood what Christianity did in its own day. He understood it very well. And he could see how the Christian movement, the declaration of Jesus Christ as Lord, Jesus as Christos, those two words put side by side, how explosive that was. That was a grenade. And he understood how those two words put side by side was basically overturned the value system of ancient Rome. It inverted the honor-shame code. So those who were on the bottom now, the slaves, could be given dignity and raised up to heaven, honor, with Jesus, the Christos, who also occupied their position of slavery. They could be raised up to glory with this Christos, which was an extreme affront to Caesar, right? And so when Nietzsche wrote The Antichrist, he was aware of this dynamic of how Christianity inverted the values upside down of the ancient world, and he lamented it. And he looked at his own Christian people all around him, who, after 2,000 years, totally had lost the plot on that and lost the sense of what actually happened. And so for Nietzsche, a Christian in his day had completely lost the sense, lost the plot, was deadened to what happened back then. He said, modern people are deadened to the significance of the direct declaration of Jesus the slave actually is now Lord. And Nietzsche had a sense of the cliche of that, and how all the good Christians around him were like blind to it. They couldn't see it. And so, but Nietzsche could see it. And so when he wrote The Antichrist, he wasn't attacking the dogma or the theology of individual Christians. He was lamenting the honor-shame inversion that had happened back then. He was lamenting it, and he was targeting the original inversion. And that's why St. Paul for Nietzsche was the ultimate enemy, what he called the ultimate decadent. And he needed to attack that. I suspect, though, however, and I said this in my previous short video, I suspect that Nietzsche got caught in the weeds with the disgust of modern Christians. And I suspect, and then he actually ignored, in my opinion, he ignored his own warning, which he said in Zarathustra, which is you don't attack the religious people, you let them walk by and you keep your sword in its place. He got so understandably disgusted with the hypocrisy and the detached nature of modern Christians who killed God through their obtuseness, that he disobeyed his own warning and got dirty with the pigs himself. And that's why the Antichrist is different in tone and structure than the rest of his books. And he really got dirty with the pigs, you could say. Pigs being, I mean, those who claim a certain status of Christianity. I'm a good person, but they're detached from their own book and from the history of their own book. He went in too hard, attacking that ethos, and he got dirty. And he became, in a sense, indecent, and he paid the price for it. This is just my personal opinion. Someone can disagree. But I think that ultimately set something off in his head that that clicked, and then he lost his mind, and then he became basically an invalid for a full decade. A tragic story, but it's also interesting that Nietzsche died right at the turn of this century, which seems to me itself extremely ironic and an appropriate irony, considering what was coming in the next century, the rise of what he called grand politics and how that was going to take over the world. But back to my point, the difference between anti-Christ and anti-Christian. Nietzsche, in a sense, Nietzsche was anti-Christ in the sense that he lamented what happened back then. But quite paradoxically, he was actually pro-Christ. This is the grand paradox. He was actually more pro-Christ than anyone in his day, because he was like one of the only ones who had a historical sense of what actually happened back then, the historical significance of it. And so even if Christ was his enemy in a sense, and I don't think he really was, he could really look and appreciate and stand back with awe at what Jesus had done by allowing himself specifically to suffer a humiliation ritual death, the very worst of humiliation rituals, which was, by the way, if you suffered a humiliation death back then, your views were considered to be refuted. No one needed to debate you, because they would say, no, you're wrong, because look how you died. That's how they thought, No, you're just a piece of shit. You'd actually something would have to happen to really change that. A slave would have to actually rise from the dead in their thinking, And so people go around saying, well, yeah, he actually rose from the dead. And that was like a values explosion in their brain, which, as I said, flipped. Those at the top were honor, particularly Caesar. He is honor. But Christians come along and say, Jesus Christ, that phrase alone, or Jesus is Lord, was an inversion, which meant a slave could have honor, when before in Roman thinking, a slave could not have honor. So Nietzsche knew all these things. He understood them. And because of that, he lamented it, and so in that sense, he was anti-Christ. He understood what happened, he lamented the historical eventuality of it, and he lamented it. And so in that sense, he was anti-Christ. But in another sense, he was pro-Christ, because he had an immense respect for what Jesus had done. The historical, and particularly, he understood what St. Paul did within its context. He lamented it, but he understood it better than anyone else. So in that sense, he was actually very pro-Christ, because to understand it, to appreciate it, is something that the Christians in his day and the Christians in our day have totally lost sense of. And so, quite paradoxically, to be Christian in our day is, in a sense, anti-Christ, because you don't have a sense of this inversion that happened. You've lost the sense of that. Yet, in another sense, though, it is not to be anti-Christ, because you're at least claiming the ascetic ideal. Nietzsche called it the ascetic ideal of being a Christian. So this whole thing is so shot through with paradox. But my main point is that Nietzsche, in declaring himself antichrist, actually proved that he is not antichrist. Because in the Bible, when St. Paul or St. John or whoever talks about what an antichrist is from a Christian perspective, it was someone who did not walk in love, which, by the way, this whole love your neighbor, love your enemy, well, love your enemy particularly, that was this teaching of Jesus, that was extremely offensive to both the Jews and the Romans, that you should love your enemy. What are you talking about? That's madness. And so to be, from the true Christian perspective, from the writers of the New Testament, if you followed this Jesus, you were supposed to live out this love your enemy. You're supposed to. And their point was that if people claim to follow Jesus but they don't love their enemy, in contrary to Rome, then they're not really Christians. They're not really Christians. And so in that sense, they're antichrist, but they're claiming to be Christians, claiming the name of Jesus. So that's another sense in which you can be from the Christian perspective in the New Testament, in which you can be an Antichrist, because you're not actually living up to what you say. You're a hypocrite. And in that's the New Testament, from the Christian perspective, the true Christian perspective, what is really an Antichrist. And so for Nietzsche, looking at the Christians of his day, he's like, these people obviously don't understand this thing within its context. So quite paradoxically, they themselves are Antichrist. And it seems like now, in our world, we are surrounded by Christians who are, in fact, from that grander perspective, Antichrist. Do you see the multiple complex layers of these meanings of words that we just take for granted? And so if you see Nietzsche's book as actually anti-Christian, the anti-Christian instead of the Antichrist, it kind of really changes things a bit here. But you have to have a background knowledge of the word Christos in its context, which, in my opinion, in Nietzsche's day, he had maybe the best understanding of it than anyone did. But even then, compared to what some very few people are starting to understand now in our day, even then, Nietzsche's view of that is a bit limited. It's become much more clear now, especially after the writings of historian Tom Holland. Can you follow me this far? If you have, thanks for coming with me, and then you'll understand better. My next video, that I'll talk about Dionysus and how Dionysus operated within this original world of Caesar as Lord, which the Christians, by the way, subverted with their Jesus the humiliated slave is now Lord. There was this group of people who worshiped Dionysus, who escaped this whole architecture of seeking honor over shame. They exited both honor and shame entirely and went out to the woods, went out to the fields or whatever to worship their god Dionysus, which I will explain in the next video is an abandonment of this person's Lord or this person is shame. It's just you exit that whole dynamic entirely. And I'll get to that in the next video. Thanks if you made it this far.